My IRP for food nutrition covers water contamination on First Nations reserves. So just some background knowledge regarding the First Nations. A reserve, by definition, is a piece of land set aside by the Queen to be governed by a band. On a reserve, the band is the government. It's like a council, and that is what governs the land. Reserves are spiritual homes for those who live there, and they are governed by a movement known as the Indian Act. The First Nations of Canada have had a history of experiencing harsh living conditions. Most of these problems started after the residential schools started closing. That was in between the 1980s and the 1990s. They faced problems such as drug abuse, alcoholism, suicide rates, but one of the biggest problems that still remains to this day is water contamination. A recent study showed that 66% of all First Nations reserves in Canada has been under a water boil advisory at least once in the past decade. So what does that mean? Water contamination is a result of contaminants being exposed to the natural environment, and it's usually done through human activities. This can be detrimental to human health and is a very serious issue if left for too long. On most reserves, this issue is one that is constant. However, one question that I often ask is what causes it? What are some factors that play into contaminating water? Well, there are many, but to narrow it down to some of the biggest ones, I will do so. For starters, there is a lack of government support. The Canadian government has always seemed to never offer support to reserves, and during a water crisis, it can be quite dangerous. I can tell you from personal experience, having a cottage on an island that is a First Nations reserve, that the government isn't completely fair to these people. The government frequently provides insufficient funding to aid in water treatment, and that can be quite dangerous. Water treatment plants are very expensive. They can cost anywhere between $8 and $12 million, and I can tell you right now that probably 100% of reserves in Canada do not have that type of money. That's why they look to the government for funding to build said plants. However, the government rarely grants that much to reserves, and if they do grant them, it is not nearly the amount they need. Another example of the government's lack of support is what the Indigenous people call a blind eye. Throughout history, there has always seemed to be a negligence towards First Nations people. There is and have always been a significant lack of government care for reserve communities. A famous and relatively recent example would be the Neskantaga crisis. I'll cover more on that in a bit, but in there, they were in a state of emergency, and the Indigenous Services of Canada, which is an extension of the government, refused to provide evacuation support. And we can also look at residential schools as a very famous example of mistreatment from the government. In addition, we also have faulty water treatment systems. Now, this one's very important. The vast majority of reserves in Canada lack water treatment technology, and it is mainly because of how expensive these treatment plants are. As I said before, $8 and $12 million. If a reserve does get money from the government to build a water treatment plant, well, that's great. They can build the plant. But the real cost comes from the distribution of the treated water. Once decontaminated, the water would need to be pumped into people's homes and for the residents to use clean water. That would involve piping, water pumps, and etc. However, that is also very expensive, if not more. Routing the pipes or building a pump are just some of the costly challenges that would come with building a distribution system. You would have to dig into people's houses. It would be very time-consuming and very costly. Furthermore, if the government does decide to fund something like this, it will be nowhere near enough. That usually would result in faulty pipes, which can be dangerous because without good pipes, things such as E. coli, mercury poisoning, and others can contaminate the water and once again make it unsafe to drink or use. And finally, we have degraded water sources. Now, this one is very important. Canada is home to 18% of the world's fresh surface water. However, on the majority of reserves in Canada, the water tends to be contaminated. One of the worst causes for a water source to become contaminated is sewage leaking into the body of water. That can lead to waterborne diseases such as guinea worm disease, typhoid, dysentery, and even various skin diseases. Poorly made piping systems from people's houses can cause sewage to leak into the ground, mix with groundwater, and eventually make its way into these large bodies of water. And in some more extreme cases, the sewage just goes straight into the water. Both are highly dangerous. Another main cause for contamination is pollution, which, as of right now, is one of the leading causes for contamination of water in Canada. Pollutants can be anything from litter to gasoline from boats, all the way up to industrial waste. Industrial waste would be the most extreme pollutant. It can make any water dangerous to be even close to. Garbage in the water can contaminate it so that if you consume it, you'll have stomach or digestion problems. Scrap metal can cause lead poisoning, and plastic and rubber in the water can release PVC, which is toxic to the body. Pollution is very effective in contaminating water, and thus can be dangerous if not treated. Also, for real, just don't pollute the water. Now, as I mentioned before, the Neskantaga crisis. Neskantaga is an Oji-Cree First Nations community in Northern Ontario. It's very small. Its population has 265 residents. In 1995, 25 years ago, they put out a boil water advisory before every use because the water had become contaminated. 25 years later, and residents are still boiling their water every time. The water advisory has not let up. Finally, after 25 years of having unusable water, they have only recently been given money by the government to fund for a treatment plant. 25 years late. Neskantaga has become a symbol among First Nations for extreme crisis, and after finally receiving the money and building the water treatment plant, the water pump at the facility failed. This left people without running water, and if they still had water, it was completely unsafe to use. Because this community is so remote, when they went into a state of emergency, they had to evacuate people by air. During that time, Indigenous Services Canada, the extension of the government that I mentioned earlier, refused to provide any evacuation assistance, and the emergency was left completely up to the community members. To this day, they are still in that same water advisory since 1995, and Justin Trudeau plans on getting rid of it by 2021, but no such actions have been made by the government. Now here's a video that kind of outlines what the water life is like for First Nations. Now, after doing all this research and watching the videos and learning so much about this topic, I often have to ask myself, what would it be like for me to have no access to clean water? I've spent my whole life with running water, hot water, dishwashers, washing machines, tap water that I can drink. But for some people, they have none of these. And in fact, if you even use the water, you could get eczema or skin diseases, which is insane to think about. So I challenge you to think about, how would you like to have no access to clean water? Anyways, to wrap it up, for First Nations around Canada, a reality they face every day is not having access to clean water. For many years, Canadian First Nations reserves have had to experience a great deal of challenges and issues, but one of the most prominent problems that still exists to this day is water contamination. The struggles with this issue can be best explored through the lack of government support to fix the issues, faulty water treatment systems, and degraded water sources. I hope I've opened your eyes to this situation, and I implore you to do some little digging of your own, because it is really quite interesting. Here are my citations, and thank you very much.